There's a name for what happens when a woman spends years in anxiety treatment, feels a little better, but never actually fixed. Not treatment-resistant anxiety, not a personality type, not something wrong with how she responded to help. A different name entirely. And once that name lands, once the mechanism behind it becomes clear, the last several years are going to look completely different. Not because anything that happened was wrong exactly, because something that happened was incomplete. And incomplete diagnoses have a cost. That cost has a name too. Today we're going to look at 7 specific signs that ADHD was present and was being read as anxiety, not as a checklist, as a case file. Because that's what it is. Here is the first thing worth knowing. The clinical picture of ADHD that most practitioners were trained on was built almost entirely from research on young boys. Hyperactive, disruptive, impossible to miss. That picture became the template. And when a high-functioning girl walked in, organized enough on the outside, articulate, clearly trying, she didn't match the template, so the template looked for something else. What it found was worry, avoidance, physical tension, difficulty concentrating, sleep disruption, a nervous system that never fully settled. All of those things were real. Every single symptom was genuinely present. The question that didn't get asked was, where were they coming from? Because anxiety can produce those symptoms, and so can something else entirely. A brain running a decades-long compensation system with no external support and no accurate name for what it was compensating for. Research on this has been consistent for years now. Women with ADHD wait, on average, significantly longer for an accurate diagnosis than men. And the most common detour on the way to that diagnosis is anxiety. Sometimes depression. Often both, because both are real and both are downstream of the thing that was missed. It makes complete sense that the anxiety diagnosis felt partially right. It was partially right. The anxiety was happening. What wasn't visible was the root, and a treatment that addresses only the anxiety without reaching the executive dysfunction underneath it will always work a little, and never enough. That's not a failure of the treatment. That's not a failure of the woman receiving it. That's what happens when you treat a symptom without ever finding the source. So let's walk through what that actually looked like. The first sign, worry that arrives without a clear trigger. Not worry about something specific. Not a fear that has an object you can name. Just a low, persistent hum of dread that seems to follow no logic and respond to no reassurance. The standard read on this is generalized anxiety. And that's not unreasonable. But here is what was actually happening. A brain with ADHD processes time differently. The future doesn't feel distant. It feels abstract, almost non-existent, until it's suddenly immediate. And a brain that can't reliably locate itself in time compensates by staying alert, always scanning, always bracing. Not because something is wrong, because the nervous system learned that not being ready has a cost, and it decided to stay ready forever. That is not generalized anxiety. That is time blindness, generating anticipatory dread. And an anxiolytic can soften the edges of it without ever addressing what's underneath. The second sign, the inability to relax, even in situations that are objectively safe. The vacation that didn't feel restful. The quiet Sunday that somehow felt worse than the week. The weekend with nothing scheduled that produced its own specific kind of dread. This is what hypervigilance looks like when it's been built over decades of masking. When you spend years performing competence in a system that isn't built for your brain, the nervous system stops knowing how to stand down. It learned that gaps are dangerous, that unstructured time is where things fall apart. That relaxing is how you end up behind. The anxiety diagnosis named the hypervigilance. It didn't ask what built it. The third sign, anxiety that spikes before tasks, but not in the social situations typically associated with anxiety disorders. She could walk into a room full of strangers and manage it. But opening an email she'd been avoiding for 3 days could produce the same physical response as a genuine threat. That pattern is specific. It maps onto task paralysis, the particular freeze that happens when the ADHD brain reaches a task it cannot generate a start signal for. The freeze feels like fear. From the inside, it is indistinguishable from fear. But the trigger isn't danger. The trigger is the absence of the neurological signal that tells the brain to begin. That's not performance anxiety. That's executive dysfunction wearing anxiety's face. The fourth sign, physical symptoms, racing heart, shallow breathing, that specific tightness across the chest that appear before tasks or transitions without a named fear attached to them. Not before the presentation. Before deciding whether to start preparing for the presentation. Not before the difficult conversation. Before the moment of picking up the phone to have it. The body was responding to something real. The question is what? And what it was responding to was the moment the brain recognized a transition was required and couldn't find the structure to make it. The body knows before the mind does when the system is about to reach its limit. It was never catastrophizing, it was reporting accurately. Now we come to the signs that should have raised different questions entirely. The fifth sign is the one that should have changed everything. The anxiety that disappeared during hyperfocus. Real anxiety disorders don't resolve the moment engagement increases. Generalized anxiety follows you into the task. Social anxiety follows you into the room. The nervous system doesn't stand down just because something interesting arrived. But ADHD anxiety does. When the interest is high enough, when the stimulation is sufficient, when the task has the specific texture the ADHD brain can lock onto, the dread lifts. The body unclenches. The scanning stops, not because willpower arrived, because the brain finally has what it needs to sustain attention without effort, and the entire defensive system it built to compensate for not having that temporarily goes offline. If that has been your experience, anxiety that evaporates when you're absorbed and returns the moment the absorption ends, that is not a feature of anxiety. That is a feature of ADHD. The sixth sign, a medication history that helped emotionally but did nothing for the actual inability to function. SSRIs that took the edge off the despair. Benzodiazepines that quieted the body. Therapy that built genuine insight and still left the executive dysfunction completely intact. It makes complete sense that these things helped. The anxiety and depression were real. The relief was real. But if the planning still fell apart, if the task paralysis persisted, if the gap between intention and execution remained exactly as wide as it had always been, that gap was not being touched. Because it wasn't anxiety in the gap, it was something the anxiety medication was never designed to reach. The seventh sign, the collapse that looked like burnout or a depressive episode, but arrived on a cycle that tracked task load and demand, not mood events. Not after a loss, after a deadline season. Not after a rupture in a relationship. After 6 weeks of performing at a level the brain couldn't sustain. The pattern was there. It was in the history. It would have been visible if someone had been looking for it. They weren't looking for it, because the template they were using didn't include it. Here is the thing that is hardest to hold and most important to say. She wasn't difficult to diagnose. She was diagnosed using the wrong frame. And a wrong frame, applied with confidence by someone she trusted, in a system she believed was built to help her. That is not a personal failure. That is a systemic one. The anxiety was real. Every symptom was real. The suffering was real. And the root was somewhere the system never thought to look. Not evidence of who she is. Evidence of what was missed. There's a specific kind of residue that tends to arrive at this exact point in the recognition. Not just grief for the years. Something more like, I should have known. I should have pushed harder. I should have figured it out. That residue lands on the woman, even when the failure was never hers to carry. If that's where you are right now, there's a workbook in the description built specifically for that moment. For working through the exact beliefs that a lifetime of wrong explanations installs, and beginning to replace them with a framework that actually fits what happened. The link is there when you're ready. Before moving forward, the objection that's probably already arrived, maybe the anxiety diagnosis was right. Maybe this is just a new way of explaining the same old failures. Here is what's actually true. Both can be real at the same time. Anxiety is real. The ADHD is real. And in most women who received the anxiety diagnosis first, both were present. Because ADHD, unrecognized and unmanaged, generates anxiety as a natural consequence. A brain that has been trying to compensate for executive dysfunction for 30 years without support, without language, without tools. That brain is going to be anxious. Of course it is. The anxiety is not a misreading, it's a downstream effect. The question that changes things is not which diagnosis is right. It's what was the root and was it ever treated? And here is what shifts when that question gets answered with something more accurate. The record changes. Not the events. Those are fixed. The interpretation of the events. Every time the anxiety spiked before a task, it was not evidence of fragility. It was a nervous system responding to a brain that didn't have what it needed. Every collapse that looked like weakness was a system reaching the end of what it could sustain without the right support. Every gap between who she knew she was and what she was able to produce, that was not character. That was neurology. The practical thing, the one small thing that belongs in the next week, not the next year, is this. The next time the anxiety arrives before a task, before a transition, before something with no clear structure, ask a different question. Not, what am I afraid of? But, what does my brain need to begin? Sometimes the answer is a deadline that's real. Sometimes it's a body double, another person nearby. Sometimes it's noise, or movement, or the first sentence spoken out loud before a single word is written. The anxiety was always reporting something accurate. What it was reporting was not a threat from the outside. It was a brain waiting for the signal it needed and not finding it. That is a completely different starting place. If this opens something you want to go further with, the specific residue of years spent treating something adjacent to the actual root, there's a resource in the description built for exactly that. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Which of these 7 signs did you recognize first? And how long had you been given a different explanation for it? There's a name for what happens when a woman spends years in treatment that was working on the wrong thing. It's not a character flaw. It's not evidence that she's beyond reach. It's not proof that something is fundamentally broken in how she's built. It's what happens when a system built on incomplete data meets a presentation it wasn't trained to recognize. There are years in this that look different now. The therapy that helped but never resolved it. The prescriptions that softened the edges but left the center untouched. The appointments where she described her symptoms as accurately as she could and left with an explanation that was partially right and not quite enough. Those years were not wasted in the way it feels like they were. She was navigating without a complete map, and she kept going anyway, kept showing up to the appointments, kept trying the strategies, kept believing there was something on the other side of the treatment that would finally feel like solid ground. That persistence was not naivete. It was accurate. There was something on the other side. It just had a different name than the one she was given. The anxiety was real. Every symptom was real. The root was somewhere else. And now she has language for the root. What she does with that language is hers. There is no requirement to perform a transformation. No timeline for how fast the reframe should arrive. No benchmark for how much better she should feel by the end of a video. What's available right now is simpler than that. A more accurate record. 7 places where the old explanation can be quietly replaced by one that actually fits. Not evidence of who she is, navigation toward who she always was. She was never the problem. The frame was.